Like many questions when it comes to the alcohol and drug world, there's not a simple, easy answer. The issue of consumption is confounded by how these statistics are tracked in different countries. Sometimes it's a question of sales, sometimes it's a question of how much is manufactured, sometimes it's a result of surveys of drinking habits. But generally, Eastern European countries tend to show up high on lists of the highest consumption countries in the world. Moldova, Poland, the Serbian countries, and countries of the former Soviet Union. And in fact, I think I read somewhere recently that in the Soviet Union, approximately 15 years are taken off the lives of the average Russian male because of drinking. This is a pretty obscure question. The right answer is the Office of Treatment Improvement, OTI, which preceded the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment about 15 plus years ago. Not many students are able to find this one. If you have found it, then you have looked pretty hard. This one should have been fairly easy. The federal agency that sponsors the National Recovery Month is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And I would strongly recommend that you spend some time visiting the Recovery Month website, www.recoverymonth.gov. It has a wealth of resources, especially the webcasts. Every year they have created 6 or 7 webcasts on various subjects that you can peruse at your leisure. And many of them have to do with important issues in the alcohol and drug world. For example, there might be a webcast on adolescent treatment, another one on special populations or working with the faith community. And these are particularly easy to watch during a lunch break or when you have a little extra time. Spend some time at the Recovery Month website. The year was 1971. The president was Richard Nixon. He was addressing Congress to discuss more funding for anti-drug efforts. And in this speech, he declared drugs public enemy #1. You can find earlier references to a war against drugs or a drug war, but generally this seems to be the beginning of what we call the war on drugs. This is a hot button issue. People have strong feelings about it. They tend to run across political lines with people on the very conservative end of the spectrum thinking we should be waging more war, spending more money to interdict and punish people that use drugs or sell drugs. On the other end of the political spectrum, people tend to be more focused on treatment as a response to drugs as opposed to criminal justice responses. The fact that it's Coffee Potts with an S should give you some clue that there's more than one. There is a coffee pot in Akron, Ohio, at the home, I believe it's the home of Bill Wilson. There's also a coffee pot at Brown University where the AA archives are stored, and I'm told that there may be even a third pot at Bill Wilson's home or summer home, or I guess it was retirement home, in Woodstock, New York, a place called Stepping Stones that you can visit today. If you've seen the original version of The Exorcist, you know that the voice of the demon is a pretty scary voice. It was recorded by a woman who was a character actor at the time, a well-known character actor named Mercedes McCambridge. And it's important to the recovery movement because I believe it was 1971, Bill Wilson, the co-founder of AA, organized in conjunction with Harold Hughes, the then sitting senator who was in long-term recovery, a presentation to the United States Congress. What they wanted to do was put a face on recovery. And a number of prominent Americans, including astronaut Buzz Aldrin, Bill Wilson himself, and Mercedes McCambridge, testified before Congress about their recovery status. This was very important because it was really the first opportunity for the public to see that People with addictive disorder were not just homeless, skid row, quote, derelicts, but really all kinds of Americans from all walks of life. The Volstead Act was the national legislation that initiated national prohibition. During this era, much of the alcohol manufactured illegally was in the hills of Appalachia. And from Appalachia, they would run the moonshine into the major metropolitan areas, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, Chicago, etc. In order to move the product from the hills to the cities, one needed fast cars, because the revenue agents who were charged with trying to stop the illegal product from coming into the cities would chase the moonshiners. Those cars that carried the moonshine were equipped with large tanks in the trunk to hold the product and fast engines, often with horsepower substantially increased. And when the men who were driving these cars and transporting the moonshine had time on their hands, they would race their cars against each other. This era was chronicled in the movie Thunder Road, starring Robert Mitchum. And my understanding is that this was the birth of stock car racing, which is, by some accounts, the fastest growing spectator sport in the United States. This was the year that the first ever facility specifically for the treatment of public inebriates was created in the United States, and it was in Binghamton, New York. Prior to that, there had been mental institutions and, of course, prisons, which tended to be the places where people with addictive disorder ended up. Binghamton's was the first alcohol rehabilitation hospital, or it was called an asylum, I believe. It burned down and was rebuilt, and a book about it was written by William White a number of years ago, The Whole History of the Hospital in Binghamton, New York. The early 1950s was a period of great experimentation with the psychedelic drug LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide. There were a number of psychologists and psychiatrists experimenting with LSD as an adjunct to treatment for people with mental disorders. It was thought that the psychedelic experience could be a shortcut to arriving at insights as to one's behavior and one's psychological makeup. Bill Wilson was definitely a seeker and looked for all kinds of opportunities to expand his consciousness. He had a correspondence with psychiatrist Carl Jung, the noted European psychiatrist who was a kind of a colleague and a competitor of Sigmund Freud. It's also thought that Bill Wilson had a series of conversations with Aldous Huxley, the writer, who wrote a couple of books about LSD and peyote. They are The Doors of Perception, and I believe, I'm not sure about the name of the next one. Sidney Cohen was a psychiatrist in LA, and it's thought that Bill Wilson participated in some therapeutic experiments that involved ingesting LSD. There was also a woman named Betty Eisner, a psychologist, that he was thought to have experimented with LSD. There are a variety of studies and explorations that take on this issue. The one that I'm familiar with was a study done about 20 years ago that found that country western music tended to be the music that correlated with the highest levels of consumption. And you can probably figure that one out because it tends to be a kind of a depressing kind of music. You know, my baby done left me, and I'm here alone and lonely. And there are other responses, though. Some people think that heavy metal music tends to promote consumption. One of the interesting artifacts of some of these studies is that it is generally understood that in a group of people drinking, the pace of ingestion of the alcohol tends to be determined by the fastest drinker. So if somebody is putting it away, other people will tend to keep pace with that individual. John Sebastian was the lead singer of a rock group called the Lovin' Spoonful, and a spoon features prominently in some blues songs because it was the implement in which one would heat up and dissolve heroin in water before pulling it up into a hypodermic needle for injection. In a suburb of Sacramento, California, there was a woman named Candy Lightner who had I believe, a 7-year-old daughter named Christy. And Christy was killed by a drunk driver, and it was during the process of her grief that Miss Lightner determined or found out that this individual had actually been arrested for DUI 6 or 7 times. Her anger and her grief caused her to form the organization Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which, along with several other organizations, led to major new public policy laws instituted against drinking and driving. Prior to this, drinking and driving was seen as kind of a misdemeanor. It was referred to by one writer as a folk crime, FOLK, in which people did it all the time, didn't think much about it. But following the formation of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, state after state began to implement much tougher drinking driving laws and much tougher sanctions against drinking and driving. Interestingly enough, at the time, we thought that the alcohol and drug arrest rates would go up as the DUI laws were made tougher. In many jurisdictions, though, the police had a hard time enforcing the laws because they didn't think that they were warranted. They didn't think that the tough penalties and restrictions and financial sanctions against the drinking driver were really warranted. So in many jurisdictions, the highway patrol and the local police departments needed to be trained on this alteration in public policy in order for it to be effectively implemented. The singer was Donovan. The name of the song was They Call It Mellow Yellow. The practice was to take the inside scrapings of banana peels, heat the substance in the oven, and then smoke it. It was thought that this would provide a psychedelic experience. And Donovan subsequently went on the record saying that that was not the intention of the song, but nevertheless at the time many people believed it was, especially young people exploring different drugs, believed that it was possible to get high. Another practice of the time was to take morning glory seeds, go to the hardware store, buy a package of morning glory seeds, pulverize them, soak them, and then drink the liquid. There's a chemical in there called ergot, which some people believed had psychedelic properties, or I think did have psychedelic properties, and was thought at the time that these were cheap, inexpensive, kind of natural highs. The beer that made Milwaukee famous was Schlitz, and when somebody said have a Gansett, they were referring to Narragansett beer, a favorite of the New England area. The champagne of bottled beer was Miller High Life, and the king of beers was, of course, Budweiser. Probably still is a phrase that's sometimes used by Anheuser-Busch. We clink our glasses together apparently as a holdover from the Middle Ages. It was thought that that would keep evil spirits away. I think there are also multiple explanations for this. And we call it a toast because some royalty would soak a piece of bread or toast in a beverage before they drank it and have somebody, a servant, eat that toast to see if it was poisonous. It was a way of making sure that as the king or the queen, you were not going to be offed by one of your competitors.